pleasure.
Okay, Paulo. May I have the mic for 2 seconds when I give it back to you?
Okay.
Don't be worried.
Or we can just move it.
Yeah, thank you. Bom, em primeiro lugar, eu agradeço a presença de vocês. Nós vamos começar, então, uma série de 2 falas do professor Hendrik Lorenz sobre a escravidão segundo Aristóteles. Todos devem ter um handout. Não, ninguém tem. Então, por favor, você poderia distribuir para mim, por favor? Eles estão aqui. Se você, tudo bem? Se você puder fazer isso, por favor. Esse é o handout da conferência. Haverá uma segunda conferência na sexta-feira, igualmente nessa sala, sobre é a segunda parte desse tema. Então, eu vou apresentar muito rapidamente o professor Hendrik Lorenz, que vocês todos conhecem. Já há 8 anos que ele é um assíduo membro aqui deste departamento. Nós temos aí esse consórcio na Filosofia Antiga, com uma reunião uma semana durante todos os meses de janeiro. Então, você já é considerado da casa faz bastante tempo. Mas eu gostaria de dizer que Hendrik tem uma formação exemplar, não, em Cambridge, em Oxford, e depois de ser lecturer na Corpus Christi em Oxford, em 2000 a 2001, você foi nomeado para Princeton, não? Você foi para Princeton como professor e lá atua desde 2001 e é atualmente um professor de filosofia antiga lá no departamento de Princeton. Entre vários escritos e papers, eu destacaria sobretudo o livro The Brit Within, que teve bastante impacto nos estudos em filosofia antiga, não? E agora Hendrik nos brindará com uma apresentação sobre um tema hoje já está, digamos assim, é um dos pontos difíceis da recuperação ou não de Aristóteles. Nós veremos como você vai tratar, que é a noção de escravidão em Aristóteles, do escravo natural na política 1. Eu vou já passar a palavra para vocês. Ao final, vocês poderão fazer questões, obviamente. Eu lembro que Hendrik fala uma quantidade absurda de línguas, entre as quais eu vou mencionar o grego antigo, o latim, o alemão, o francês, o inglês, o espanhol e português. Eu tenho a impressão, pelo que eu pude escutar. Muito obrigado, Hendrik, por isso. Eu passo a palavra para você.
In Book 1 of the Politics, Aristotle infamously argues that there are certain people for whom it is beneficial and just to be enslaved. In chapter 4 of that book, Book 1 of the Politics, Aristotle defines what a slave is, namely, as he puts it, a human piece of property, and a piece of property that is a tool for action that is separate from its owner. Right, that's the definition of what a slave is that he gives in Book 1, Chapter 4 of the Politics. In the next chapter, so Chapter 5, and this is the chapter that I want to focus on today, he takes up two questions. These are the two guiding questions of Chapter 5. First, whether anyone is by nature such a human being. That's to say, whether anyone is by nature a human piece of property, a human tool for action, right? So this takes up the definition from Chapter 4 and asks whether anyone is by nature such. And secondly, the second guiding question of Chapter 5 is whether or not it is better and just for anyone to be enslaved. Right? So there are two claims. It's just for people who meet that description to be enslaved, and second, it's beneficial for people who meet that description to be enslaved. By the end of the chapter, so by the end of Book 1, Chapter 5, Aristotle has answered both of these questions in the affirmative. Aristotle says that it's not difficult to grasp these matters by argument or to learn about them from what in fact happens. Presumably what he means by this is that in the course of this chapter, he is going to offer a determination by argument of the answers to his two guiding questions. But he also thinks that his affirmative answers to those questions are supported by what happens in the world. In other words, he thinks that his readers can see by observation of their own social environment that some people are by nature slaves. That is to say that they are naturally suited to being human pieces of property, and that it is better and just for such people to be enslaved. Aristotle's argument for his positive answers begins as follows. He calls attention to structures that feature hierarchical relations in which one part of a structure rules and another part is ruled. When the part that rules is suited to ruling and the part that is ruled is suited to being ruled, the arrangement, Aristotle thinks, is beneficial. Now, from the start of the Politics, Aristotle is concerned to distinguish between different forms of rule, such as kingly rule, political rule, and despotic or masterly rule. The central claim of the argument that he presents in our chapter is that there are hierarchical relations among human beings in which the appropriate form of rule is despotic, masterly. When one person exercises despotic rule over another, and the person ruling in this way is suited to such rule, and the other person is likewise suited to being ruled in this way, despotic rule, the rule of a master over a slave, is, Aristotle thinks, just and beneficial. The model for despotic rule that Aristotle proposes, and on which he relies heavily in developing his argument, is the rule of the soul over the body. Now, it has been argued by William Fortenbaugh in an influential article that was published in 1977 that Aristotle in fact operates with a different model of despotic rule, namely a model of the rule of reason over the emotions. It has also been argued, this is by Nicholas Smith, this was published in 1991, that Aristotle's theory of natural slaves is flawed, defective, not only because of its repugnant conclusion that enslaving people is sometimes beneficial and just, but also for a reason internal to Aristotle's own theoretical framework, namely because Aristotle opts to model despotic rule on the basis of soul-body rule, rather than modeling it on reason-desire rule, which by Aristotle's own lights, right, that is the objection that Smith articulated, would have been more adequate in the case of people who are enslaved and in a position to benefit from the reason of their masters. I want to argue, by contrast, that in theorizing slavery, Aristotle quite consistently operates with the soul-body model of despotic rule, and that there are no pressures generated by Aristotle's own theory to model despotic rule on anything other than soul-body rule. I will argue that there is nothing in Aristotle's theory that even suggests that the rule of reason over desire, or the rule of reason over the emotions, would have been a more adequate model for despotic rule, or in other words, for the rule of a master over a slave, than the rule of the soul over the body. It's important, I think, to say right away that I am not concerned in the slightest to defend Aristotle's theory, which I reject completely and without any qualifications. Nor am I meaning to say that the theory's internal consistency is a significantly positive feature that should be appreciated, perhaps in some rather qualified and limited way. What I am meaning to insist on is that there are no elements at all in Aristotle's own theory that suggest or militate in favor of a less harsh, less repugnant, and somehow more humane conception of the rule of a master over a slave. Aristotle's theory of natural slaves is without a doubt one of Aristotle's most influential theories. It's also a theory whose influence and reception has caused grave harm. My present task is not to examine that influence or the history of the reception of Aristotle's theory, although I will talk a bit about the reception and influence of Aristotle's theory on Friday. Today, I'm taking up a much more modest task, but one which I take to be an indispensable prerequisite for a well-informed historical reconstruction of its influence and reception history. So the task I want to take up today is to present a historical reconstruction of the theory itself and of the reasons and arguments on which it rests. So then let's turn to the details of chapter 5. Here's how Aristotle himself introduces the rule of soul over body as a model for despotic rule, right? So as a model for the rule of master over slave. This is text 1 on the handout. So it's from 1254a34 following, where Aristotle says, soul and body are the first constituents of an animal, of which by nature the soul is ruler and the body is ruled. And one should examine what is natural in things whose condition is natural, not corrupted. One should therefore study the human being too, whose soul and body are in the best condition, in whom this is clear. For in wretched, the Greek is morchteroi, people, or those in a wretched condition, the body will often seem to rule the soul because their condition is bad and unnatural. So there's a footnote on the Greek word morcheros, so I translate as wretched, which just means very bad. And the important thing is that while this word can mean evil or morally bad, it doesn't have to mean that. It can just mean in a very bad condition, in a bad way. So, for example, very sick. Aristotle goes on, at any rate, it is, as I say, in an animal that we first observe both despotic rule and political rule. For the soul rules the body with despotic rule, whereas reason rules desire with political or kingly rule. In these cases, it's evident that it is natural and beneficial for the body to be ruled by the soul, and for the affective or emotional part to be ruled by reason, i.e. by the part that has reason, and that it would be harmful to all if these elements were equal or if the reverse obtained. Right? So that's one key text from chapter 5 of Politics, book 1. Aristotle here introduces the relationship between the soul and the body as a type of relationship between ruler and subject. He says about that relationship that in bad and unnatural cases, the body will often seem to rule the soul rather than the other way around. And he also says that the soul rules the body with despotic rule. That's to say, right, with the rule of a master, distinguishing this case from the way reason rules desire with political or kingly rule, or in other words, with the rule of a statesman or a king. Elsewhere in the Politics, Aristotle makes clear that political and kingly rule are forms of rule over free subjects. The difference being that political rule is between people who are more or less equal, whereas kingly rule is between unequals. At the beginning of chapter 12 of Book 1, Aristotle says about the expertise of household management that it has three parts. A despotic one, which is the expertise about how to rule slaves, a paternal one that relates to children, and a marital one that relates to the patriarch's rule over his wife. He goes on as follows, and this is text 2 on the handout. For a man rules his wife and children both as free people, but not in the same way. Instead, he rules his wife the way a statesman does, and his children the way a king does. While Aristotle thinks that the political and kingly forms of rule are appropriate for the rule over free people, he thinks that despotic rule, by contrast, is rule over unfree subjects, such as, of course, slaves. Moreover, he takes there to be a further important difference between political and kingly rule on the one hand and despotic rule on the other. This is from Book 3, Chapter 6, where he says, for rule by a master, although in truth the same thing is beneficial for both natural masters and natural slaves, is nevertheless rule exercised for the sake of the master's own benefit, and only coincidentally for that of the slave. For rule by a master cannot be preserved if the slave is destroyed. By contrast, Aristotle thinks that the patriarch's rule over his children and his wife, which are supposed to be cases of kingly and political rule, as he says, is either for the sake of the ruled or for the sake of something common to both. Right? So the second idea is that whereas despotic rule aims at the benefit of only the ruler, kingly and political rule aims at the benefit either of the ruled or at the common benefit of ruler and ruled. We should ask how the soul-body relationship is supposed to be a case of despotic rule of all things. I suggest that two features of Aristotle's moral psychology are crucial. Firstly, the soul, Aristotle thinks, does not need to persuade the body to carry out its desires. If all goes as it should, and as it normally does, the soul issues an impulse, which can be a rational impulse or a non-rational impulse, and bodily movement comes about automatically or mechanically. The body has no choice in the matter. And secondly, Aristotle thinks that when the soul uses the body in obtaining its objects of desire, the soul acts for its own sake, to satisfy its own desires, be they rational or non-rational. The body in and of itself does not have desires, but is just a tool for action that the soul uses. But now, what sense can be made of Aristotle's remark that in the case of wretched people, or people who are in a bad condition, their body seems to rule their soul? It should not be a matter of someone acting on non-rational desire or impulse, either against reason or by co-opting reason, as that would be a case of desire ruling reason, as opposed to a case of the body ruling the soul. Perhaps Aristotle has in mind cases in which someone wants to do something but is unable to do it, not because of a conflicting desire, but rather because of some bodily or physiological obstacle. For example, severe intoxication, paralysis, or the like. Aristotle provides what I think is a suitable example in a passage in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 13, in which he introduces the part of the soul that is non-rational, but capable of obeying reason. The passage is worth quoting in full, and so it's text 3 on my handout, where Aristotle says, another nature in the soul would also seem to be non-rational, though in a way it shares in reason. For in the self-controlled and the unself-controlled person, we praise their reason. That is to say, the part of the soul that has reason, because it exhorts them correctly and toward what is best. But they evidently also have in them some other part, that is by nature something apart from reason, clashing and struggling with reason. For just as paralyzed parts of a body, when people decide to move them to the right, do the contrary and move off to the left, the same is true of the soul. For unself-controlled people have impulses in contrary directions. In bodies, admittedly, we see the part go astray. whereas we do not see it in the soul. Nonetheless, presumably, we should suppose that the soul also has something apart from reason, countering and opposing reason. The passage is useful for our purposes because it draws a sharp contrast between two ways in which someone may fail to do something that they want to do, or at least struggle to do something that they want to do. In one case, the obstacle is a non-rational impulse that conflicts with an impulse of reason. In the other case, of particular interest for our purposes, the obstacle is some part of the body that moves in a way that is contrary to the person's decision to act. This type of case may take different forms, including cases of paralysis, spasms, and other types of involuntary behavior, such as, for example, speech impediments, and perhaps some forms of uncontrollable behavior that we would describe as compulsive. They may be manifestations of chronic or permanent conditions, or they may be temporary or even fleeting conditions. And so Aristotle is thinking, I suggest, that ordinarily the soul rules the body by producing impulses, rational or non-rational ones, that cause bodily movement without there being any need for the soul to do any work to obtain the body's compliance. Soul and body are related in such a way that the body carries out the soul's impulses without having a choice in the matter. On the other hand, Aristotle says that in the case of the relationship between reason and desire, the natural and appropriate form of rule is political or kingly rule, and presumably this is supposed to be more a case of kingly than of political rule, given the inequality between reason and desire in Aristotle's moral psychology, and given that Aristotle thinks that in the case of significant inequality between ruler and subject, the appropriate form of rule is kingly. Aristotle also says in our passage that it would be harmful if the elements in question were equal. Perhaps he mentions political rule, a form of rule appropriate in cases in which ruler and subject are more or less equal, because he keeps in mind that wish or rational desire, in Aristotle's Greek that's boulesis, is one kind or form of desire and is so closely related to reason itself that it would not make sense to think that it is significantly inferior to reason. However, Aristotle takes the two forms of non-rational desire, appetite and spirit, to be quite distinct from reason and to be unequal and inferior to reason. As we have seen already, it's also part of Aristotle's moral psychology that non-rational desire can conflict with reason, as in the case of psychological conflicts that are characteristic of self-controlled and unself-controlled people. And so obedience of desire to reason in Aristotle's theoretical framework is not automatic. On many occasions, obedience of desire to reason can only be achieved, Aristotle thinks, by some kind of internal persuasion, whereby reason persuades desire. Furthermore, whereas despotic rule is only for the good of the master, kingly and political rule are, as we have seen on Aristotle's view, in important part for the sake of the ruled subject. In the case of a well-organized and well-administered soul, Aristotle thinks, many things that are done will satisfy the desires of appetite and spirit, the non-rational desires, and often at least part of the point of the action, or even the main point of the action, is to satisfy such a desire. For example, when a virtuous person enjoys a fine wine, or exerts herself so as to win a prize in an athletic competition. About both of these cases, the relationship between soul and body, and that between reason and desire, Aristotle says, plausibly and reasonably, that it is, as he says, natural and beneficial for the body to be ruled by the soul, and for the emotional part of the soul to be ruled by reason. Aristotle then extends this point about the benefit of ruling and being ruled to the relationships between humans and non-human animals, and between males and females. For our purposes, what he says about non-human animals is particularly important because of the close comparison that Aristotle draws between non-human animals and the group of people that he calls natural slaves. So this is text 4 on the handout. The same applies in the case of humans, with respect to non-human animals. For tame animals are by nature better than wild ones, and for all of them it is better to be ruled by humans, since in this way they attain safety. Aristotle does not make it explicit, but presumably he thinks that the form of rule appropriate to the rule of humans over domestic animals, such as beasts of burden, is also despotic rule, modeled on the rule of the soul over the body. Aristotle is now ready to turn to the question of whether there are human beings who are by nature slaves. So that's an absolutely central text to the whole discussion in that chapter, and this is text 5 on my handout. Those people then who are as different from others as body is from soul, or non-human animal from human, and people whose work, ergon in the Greek, is the use of their body, and that is the best thing to come from them, are in this condition, those people are natural slaves. And it's better for them to be subject to this kind of rule, since it's also better for the other things we mentioned. For he who can belong to someone else, and that is why he does belong to someone else, and he who associates with reason to the extent of perceiving it, but not of having it, for the non-human animals obey not reason but feelings, is a natural slave. The difference in the use made of them, that's to say, the difference in the use made of natural slaves and non-human animals, this difference in the use made of them, Aristotle says, is small, since both slaves and domestic animals help provide the necessities with their bodies. The central idea on which Aristotle attempts to place the weight of supporting his justification of slavery is that some humans differ from others, that is to say, from people Aristotle recognizes as naturally free, in the way that the body differs from the soul, or in the way that a non-human animal differs from a human being. Now, at first sight, both of these comparisons may seem deeply puzzling. After all, on Aristotle's own view, the humans he regards as natural slaves, as he puts it, associate with reason, so the Greek is koinonon logu, to the extent of perceiving it, but not having it. So the Greek is aisthanestai alame echein. So a natural slave, as Aristotle conceives of them, is a lot more like a free Greek man like Aristotle himself than a human body is like a human soul. Given that natural slaves, as conceived by Aristotle, have emotions and desires, and given that, on Aristotle's own conception, human bodies as such have no desires or emotions at all, as Aristotle takes all emotions and all desires, both rational and non-rational ones, to belong to the soul, not to the body. Furthermore, Aristotle takes the human beings he regards as natural slaves even to associate with reason in a way, namely by being able to perceive reason. What he means by this is illuminated by a comment that he makes near the end of Book 1 of the Politics in chapter 13, where he says that those who deny reason to slaves but tell us to give them orders only are mistaken. For slaves should be admonished more than children. What Aristotle has in mind then is that the human beings he regards as natural slaves are able to comprehend orders as well as admonitions, where the latter claim, I take it, comes down to the thought that they're able to improve their behavior not only in response to punishment, but also in response to criticism. So I take it that's what admonition means, criticism. This sensitivity to reason, limited though it is, makes natural slaves, as Aristotle conceives of them, even more similar to free Greek men like Aristotle himself, making it even harder to understand what Aristotle may have in mind in saying that the two groups of people, right, the natural slaves and the naturally free people, differ as much from one another as body and soul. Given the natural slave's ability, as Aristotle sees it, to perceive reason, it also seems an overstatement on Aristotle's part to say that they differ from naturally free people in the way that non-human animals differ from humans. So what's going on here? My suggestion is this. What we need to do in order to grasp properly what Aristotle has in mind, and in doing so, to grasp what really is the idea on which he attempts to place the full weight of justifying slavery, is this. So I think this is what is going on in this key passage. We must construe the alleged distance between the two groups of people, natural slaves and naturally free people, whom Aristotle regards as, on the one hand, natural slaves and on the other hand as naturally free. We must construe that difference not in psychological or cognitive terms, but in terms of their functional roles. The best thing that comes from natural slaves, Aristotle says, is the use of their bodies. It's the use of their bodies, he also says, that is their work or function, right? The Greek word is ergon. On this view, that which a natural slave in relation to their master, a body in relation to its soul, and a domestic animal, like an ox or a horse, in relation to its owner or user, that which all these three cases have in common is that the best thing that can come from all three, and so their work, their ergon, is some use of their body. Now, this is a tautology in the case of the body itself. It's a step, but an easy one, in the case of a domestic animal. And no doubt it's supposed to be another easy step in the case of the people Aristotle regards as natural slaves. So according to this stark, but I think intelligible contrast that Aristotle lays out, whereas bodies, human bodies that is, domestic animals and natural slaves share as their work or function the use of the kind of body in question, the people Aristotle regards as naturally free men have as their work or function an active life of reason, right? As he says in the famous ergon argument, function argument in Book 1, Chapter 7 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Right? So whereas natural slaves, or the people Aristotle describes as natural slaves, have as their ergon some use of their body specifically, adult, free men have as their work or function an active life of reason. A life guided and shaped by the use of their own rational capacities, which include the full range of capacities of deliberative and theoretical reason. Looked at in this way, we can, I think, see why Aristotle holds that the distance between the two groups of people, those he regards as natural slaves and those he regards as naturally free, is vast. It's huge. As vast as is the distance that separates the body from the soul and a non-human animal from a human being. In sketching the psychological profile of members of the group of people whom he regards as natural slaves, Aristotle appeals not only to their alleged lack of reason, but also to their alleged ability to belong to someone else, as he puts it, saying that they can belong to someone else, which is why they do belong to someone else. In saying this, Aristotle presumably has in mind, perhaps among other things, that some human beings have weakly developed spirited parts of their souls, those parts which, in the framework of Aristotle's moral psychology, are the psychological source of anger, self-esteem, and of desires for social status, and also for dominating others. Those in Asia, Aristotle infamously says elsewhere, lack spirit, and adds that it's precisely why they are ruled and enslaved. This is in Politics, Book 7, Chapter 7, and we'll talk about this. I'll talk about this a fair amount on Friday. Aristotle also says about non-Greeks that they are by nature more slavish in their character than Greeks, those in Asia being more so than those in Europe, and he thinks that for this reason they tolerate rule by a master without any complaint. This is in Politics, Book 3, Chapter 14. By contrast, a person with a strongly developed spirit would be disposed to resist and take offense at despotic rule, and so would be of little or no use to their master, since neither commands nor admonitions nor criticisms would be sufficient to achieve compliance, and a recurrent or even constant need for discipline and punishment would presumably undermine the enslaved person's utility. So I want to just briefly take stock now. I take myself to have explained Aristotle's conception of despotic rule. So that's sort of what I wanted to say by way of explaining what that conception is, what despotic rule for Aristotle is. And also I take myself to explain its completely consistent application to the hierarchical relationship between master and slave. The next thing I want to do, and that's also the last thing I want to do for today, is I want to consider and reject some reasons one might have for thinking that by Aristotle's own lights, the reason-desire or reason-emotion model is more appropriate than the soul-body model for conceiving the type of rule that is appropriate for a master over a slave in cases in which both master and slave meet the conditions that Aristotle thinks suit them for their roles as master and slave. So these are sort of various reasons that people might have, and in some cases these are reasons that people in the literature have actually produced for offering Aristotle sort of a more humane, if you like, softer theory of the hierarchical relationship between master and slave. So here's one reason for sort of softening Aristotle's picture a bit. Aristotle holds that the people he considers natural slaves, as we saw, associate with reason by perceiving reason. Since natural slaves can perceive or understand reason, one might think, they have a rational capacity, or maybe some set of rational capacities that can be cultivated and educated. Once they benefit from this kind of cultivation or education of their rational capacities, they get to enjoy reason. This is a phrase that Smith uses in his 1991 paper. At this point, the reason-emotion model becomes more adequate, one might think, for master-slave rule than the soul-body model. So this is a reason articulated by Smith. My response. Much depends on what is meant by perceiving reason. I take it to consist in being able to comprehend orders and to respond to criticism by changing one's behavior. We should note that this is not far removed from the abilities of a well-trained non-human animal, for example, a well-trained sheepdog. The main feature that is distinctive of natural slaves, as Aristotle conceives of them, and that elevates natural slaves, as Aristotle conceives of them, somewhat over trainable non-human animals such as sheepdogs, might be precisely this receptiveness to criticism, admonition, right, as he puts it, so that behavior can be modified by talking and not only by causing pain or pleasure. Aristotle does not seem to think that this type of low-level, marginally rational capacity can or should be cultivated or educated to any significant extent, and certainly not for its own sake or for the benefit of the enslaved person in question. There is no indication in Aristotle's text that he takes natural slaves to be able to find intellectual satisfaction, pleasure, or fulfillment in grasping explanatory relations, as might be suggested by Smith's expression, enjoy reason. The extremely limited rationality of Aristotle's natural slaves seems to be significant only because, and only to the extent that, it makes natural slaves more effective and more easily trainable tools for action than are domestic animals. If so, Aristotle's recognition of the extremely limited rationality of the people he describes as natural slaves does not militate against the complete instrumentalization of natural slaves that he envisages by modeling despotic rule on soul-body rule. It's also completely consistent with Aristotle's claim that the best thing that comes from natural slaves is the use of their body, rather than, say, rational activity of the soul. Secondly, so a second reason one might have for sort of softening Aristotle's theory, so it's this. Aristotle holds that the people he describes as natural slaves are capable of acquiring some virtue. In particular, some forms of temperance or moderation and courage. This he says in Book 1, Chapter 13. Once they do, the condition of their emotional, non-rationally desiring part is receptive to reason, or at any rate more so than before they acquire these forms of virtue. And so one might think that the natural slave's capacity for acquiring virtue makes the reason-desire model of rule more appropriate than the soul-body model of rule. My response: the virtues of natural slaves are sharply distinguished from the virtues of naturally free men, as well as from those of naturally free women. As always in the case of the virtues of someone or something, the virtues are good dispositions with respect to the relevant work or function, as Aristotle reminds the reader, in the very context of discussing the virtues of enslaved people. Since on Aristotle's view, the work of a natural slave is the use of their body, the virtues of natural slaves are tied to good bodily work. As Aristotle says in Politics, Book 1, Chapter 13, all members of the household, including slaves, must share in virtues of character such as courage and temperance. But he adds, not in the same way, rather each must have a share sufficient to enable them to perform their own work. A little later in the same chapter, Aristotle adds that we have said that a slave is useful in relation to the things that are necessary, so that it's clear that they need only a small amount of virtue, namely, just as much as will prevent them from inadequately performing their works through intemperance or cowardice. The point of these virtues is simply to make natural slaves better, more effective tools. These virtues are imparted and maintained to benefit the master and not to benefit the slave. The soul-body model of rule is adequate to this conception in a way that the reason-desire model would not be, since on the latter model, the reason-desire model, the appropriate form of rule, kingly or political, would specifically aim at the benefit of the subject. Third reason, right, for softening Aristotle's picture, it's this: Aristotle in Politics 1:6 says that cases in which masters and slaves are naturally suited to their roles, Aristotle says there that in cases in which masters and slaves are naturally suited to their roles, there is friendship between them. So this is text 6 on the handout. For the same thing is beneficial for both part and whole, body and soul, and a slave is a sort of part of his master, a sort of living but separate part of his body. Right? So the idea is that a slave is a sort of living but separate part of the master's body. Hence, Aristotle goes on, there is a certain benefit and affection, as I here translate philia, I will discuss this in a minute. So there is a certain benefit and affection in relation to one another for such masters and slaves as deserve to be by nature so related. When their relationship is not that way, however, but is based on law, and they have been subjected to force, the opposite holds. One might compare what Aristotle says about the same topic, the possibility of friendship between masters and slaves, in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 8, Chapter 11. So the text is on the handout, it's text 7 on the handout, but I want to say a few things by way of introducing that text. So there, in that text, the operative notion is that in relationships in which people have nothing in common, there is no friendship, since there is no justice either. Aristotle says that there is neither friendship nor justice between users and tools, such as a craftsman and his tools, the soul and the body, and a master and his slave. The same goes for horses and cows, and once again for slaves, insofar as they are slaves. So, right, this is what he says in that text 7 on the handout. For master and slave have nothing in common, since a slave is a tool with a soul, while a tool is a slave without a soul. Insofar as he is a slave, then, there is no friendship with him. But there is friendship with him insofar as he is a human being. For every human being seems to have some relation of justice with everyone who is capable of community in law and agreement. Since every human being seems to have friendship with every human being, to the extent that every human being is a human being. Taking this passage from the Nicomachean Ethics into account, and in particular the idea that there is a friendship between a master and a slave, insofar as a slave is a human being, one might think that the existence of friendship between natural masters and natural slaves implies the existence of what Aristotle calls goodwill towards the slave on the master's part. So the Greek is eunoia, which implies a concern for and well-wishing towards the slave for the slave's own sake. That, after all, follows from the general explication of friendship that Aristotle provides in NE Book 8, Chapter 3. He says about friendship in general, right, in the Nicomachean Ethics definition of friendship, those who are friends, he says, must have goodwill to each other, wish good and be aware of it from one of the causes mentioned, namely the good, the pleasant, or the useful. Note that goodwill, eunoia, is in turn explicated as wishing goods to the friend for their own sake, as opposed to the way one might wish for the preservation of some wine that one owns so that one can have it. And so you might think that Aristotle's claim about friendship between master and slave in politics, Book 1, Chapter 6, right? So this is text 6 on the handout. You might think that the claim about friendship between master and slave there makes the complete instrumentalization of the slave implied by the soul-body model of despotic rule inadequate. So that by Aristotle's own lights, the reason-desire model is or would be more appropriate or at least less inappropriate. My response. So I have 3 objections to this interpretation, and the interpretation arises, right, from reading the comment on friendship of philia in politics, Book 1, Chapter 6, so text 6, in light of the theory of friendship that Aristotle offers in the Nicomachean Ethics, right? So in order to get that interpretation going, you need to sort of connect these 2 texts. In particular, right, the idea that friendship in the Nicomachean Ethics requires goodwill, so it requires some kind of concern for the other for their own sake, right? And then you read that into the remark that between masters and slaves there can be friendship, so that this would indicate some kind of concern on the part of the master for the slave for their own sake, as opposed to completely instrumentalizing the slave. So here are my objections. First, the word philia that features in text 6 is ambiguous between friendship, conceived of as a relationship between 2 or more individuals, and affection or love or friendliness, conceived of as an attitude toward someone or something. Given that Aristotle here in text 6 on the handout runs advantage and philia, so it's to sympheron and philia together, and writes off the advantage and philia that masters and slaves have towards one another, it is, I think, linguistically easier to take philia in the second sense, so that it means affection, love, or something like this, friendliness. On this reading, Aristotle is not implying that there can be friendship between masters and slaves in the demanding sense of the Nicomachean Ethics theory of friendship, which requires that the friends have a concern for the other for their own sake. He's only saying that in the type of case that he has in mind, there is advantage and affection for master and slave in relation to one another. Secondly, in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 8, Chapter 11, Aristotle says, as we have seen, that insofar as a slave is a slave, there can be no friendship between master and slave, since master and slave have nothing in common, given that a slave is just a tool for use by the master. Aristotle then adds, right, in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 8, he then adds, as we saw, that there can be friendship between master and slave insofar as the slave is a human being, given that all human beings share ties of justice, because they are capable of community in law and agreement. However, in the context of politics 1.6, right, in particular text 6 on the handout, Aristotle derives the philia, as I want to say the affection, right, of master and slave from the fact that masters and slaves are advantageous to one another, given that the slave is a sort of separate part of the master's body. That the slave is a sort of part of the master's body is very far from establishing that there are between master and slave ties of justice based on community in law and agreement. So in fact, it seems bizarre to interpret politics 1.6, text 6 on the handout, in light of the Nicomachean Ethics theory of friendship. But this is required for the interpretation of our passage that implies more than just instrumental concern for the slave on the master's part. Thirdly and lastly, the Eudemian ethics conception of advantage friendship as available even to non-human animals, and especially to domestic animals in relation to their owners or users, seems in fact highly relevant to the comment about friendship between master and slave in Politics 1.6. In explicating friendship in the Eudemian ethics, Aristotle says this, and this is text 8 on the handout. From this it is clear that the primary friendship is the reciprocal affection and reciprocal decision among good people. For what is loved is dear to the one who loves it, and someone who loves in return is also dear to the one who is loved. This kind of friendship, the primary kind of friendship, Aristotle says there, is found only among humans, for they alone are aware of decision, prohairesis in Greek. But the other kinds of friendship are also found among wild beasts or non-human animals, this is theria, and usefulness is even apparent to some degree between domestic animals and humans and among domestic animals, in the way that Herodotus says that the plover, that's a kind of bird, is useful to the crocodile, and diviners talk about the gatherings and separations of birds. In this passage from the Eudemian Ethics, Aristotle is introducing, among other things, a notion of utility friendship. This is a notion of mutual affection, antiphilia in the Greek, based on awareness of advantage. However, that conception does not imply concern for the other for their own sake. Aristotle says about this type of philia that it occurs among non-human animals, and adds that advantage too is to some extent present to domestic animals towards humans and towards one another. This conception of mutual affection based on mutual advantage is, I suggest, key to understanding Aristotle's comment in Politics 1.6, so text 6 on the handout, that there is advantage and affection, philia, for masters and slaves in relation to one another. If the passage is understood in this way, it does not imply any concern on the master's part for the slave for their own sake, or for that matter, any concern on the slave's part for the master's own sake. It's just a matter of recognizing the utility of the one to the other and of some kind of mutual care and affection in light of this recognition of mutual benefit. I want to consider one last reason that might be offered for thinking that by Aristotle's own lights, the complete instrumentalization implied by the soul-body model of despotic rule is inadequate to his conception of the relationship between a virtuous master and a natural slave. So this is the last sort of reason I want to consider for softening Aristotle's picture, sort of in relation to the picture that I have reconstructed. So it's this. Several scholars have argued that according to Aristotle's theory of slavery, slaves benefit from their enslavement to a virtuous master by getting to participate in the virtuous activity of the household under the rule of the virtuous patriarch. One can combine this idea with the idea that in the context of such a household, enslaved people will have character virtues such as courage and temperance, as Aristotle says they will, and will exercise those virtues in the accomplishment of their work as they contribute to and participate in the virtuous activities that constitute the communal life of the household. So one might even think that in this way, enslaved people can have a share in the human good, as Aristotle conceives of it, namely happiness or eudaimonia, right? This is activity of virtue, roughly. After all, they have a share in the activity of human virtue, both in that they themselves exercise some human virtue, the moderation and the courage that Aristotle thinks they will have, and also in that they participate in the shared virtuous activity of the household community. Would it not then be appropriate, you might ask, for the virtuous patriarch, who is their master, to recognize the value of the enslaved person's happiness, however limited it may be, and in fact to attach at least some intrinsic value to it, right? So that this would then not be sort of a relationship of complete instrumentalization on the part of the master of the slave. My response. This line of thought is, I think, profoundly alien to what Aristotle says in the Politics, both about what is psychologically and ethically possible for the people he calls natural slaves, and also about the form of rule over such people that Aristotle takes to be appropriate. Aristotle denies that natural slaves can attain happiness. That's a very clear denial, and it's in Politics, Book 3, Chapter 9. In fact, he says the same thing in the Nicomachean Ethics. There it is in Book 10, Chapter 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics. So he, both in the Nicomachean Ethics and in the Politics, denies eudaimonia, two slaves. Aristotle tells us clearly what he takes to be the work or function of a natural slave, the use of their body, as opposed to the activity of human reason. This entails that their virtues are not ones that pertain to the good accomplishment of an active life of reason, but rather ones that pertain to the good accomplishment of the unpaid physical labor that their masters extract from them. The virtues that Aristotle ascribes to natural slaves are like the virtue of an eye, by which we see well, or of a horse, by which it is disposed well for running, carrying a rider, and standing its ground against enemies in a battle. Right? These are Aristotle's own examples of virtues, aretai, as applied to an eye or a horse. This is from the discussion of the virtues of character in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 2, Chapter 6. It's true that Aristotle ascribes to natural slaves the character virtues courage and temperance. But he thinks that one can ascribe virtues and vices of character even to non-human animals, such as, for example, courage to Molossian sheepdogs. That's in his History of Animals, Book 9, Chapter 1. And the character virtue of mildness to dolphins, History of Animals, Book 9, Chapter 48. The character virtues of natural slaves in Aristotle's theoretical framework do not fit the definitions of human or unqualified character virtue that Aristotle offers in both of his ethical treatises, since they are not states that issue decisions, right? So both in the Eudemian Ethics and in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle defines virtue of character as a state that issues decisions. So the virtues of the people Aristotle calls natural slaves do not fit that definition. This is because decisions rest on deliberation, which natural slaves, as Aristotle conceives of them, are wholly incapable of. So the character virtues of natural slaves by Aristotle's lights are homonyms of the unqualified character virtues, just as are the character virtues of sheepdogs and dolphins. And Aristotle also gives a clear enough indication of just how it is that he takes enslaved people to benefit from their enslavement. As we have seen, he takes natural slaves and domestic animals to play the same type of role and to have the same type of work or function, ergon, in the household community, namely, as he puts it, to help provide the necessities with their bodies. And he specifies how it is that domestic animals benefit from being ruled despotically by their human owners or users, saying that, quote, it's better for them to be ruled by human beings, since this secures their security. Aristotle's idea seems to be that enslaved people in the context of a well-run household will attain a level of safety and security that they would be unlikely to attain otherwise. Moreover, that they exercise their own virtue simply by being effective, easily controlled tools for their master's actions, and that they participate in and contribute to the virtuous activity of the household community in just the way that their master's arms, legs, or other functional body parts contribute to it. So that by Aristotle's lights, it would be just as ridiculous to say that natural slaves have a share in happiness as it would be to say that a patriarch's arms, legs, or other functional body parts have a share in happiness. I conclude then that nothing that Aristotle says in expounding his theory of slavery in Book 1 of the Politics militates in favor of thinking that by his own lights, the complete instrumentalization of natural slaves that is implied by the soul-body model of despotic rule is inadequate to the relationship between a virtuous master and a natural slave, as Aristotle conceives of that relationship. One upshot of my discussion, to which in closing I want to call attention, is that Aristotle really does conceive of the people he regards as natural slaves as playing a functional role in the household that is extremely similar to to the role of domestic animals, especially beasts of burden such as oxen and horses. Given Aristotle's views about the relationship between and among function or work, ergon, virtue and the good, this implies that natural slaves, although biologically human, are functionally non-human and capable neither of human virtue nor of the human good. In this respect, as in so many others, Aristotle's theorizing in ethics and political theory seems to be close to Greek popular morality, given that the animalization of slaves in Greek culture is noticeable both in the Greeks' preferred tool for punishing slaves, which is the whip in Greek mastics, a tool strongly associated with punishing horses, and even in the common word for slaves, which is andrapodon, a similar word in form to tetrapus, a common word for livestock. Thank you.
Thank you. This is for you.
This was for me? Okay, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It was very clear, and then we can go for the discussion. May I just ask you 2 or 3 things in order to get a clearer idea of your thesis? So you try to show that all way of softening up the thesis from passage from the Nicomachean Ethics, well, mostly from the Nicomachean Ethics, the softening up does not work. At the end of the day, you have this brutal thing in the politics in which the basic opposition is between soul and body, and a slave is a sort of possession, a ktema, property, and it is taken as any other beast, and it's assimilated to this sort of beast of burden, notably, right? This is your main contention. So you try to show that all those scholars that try to do this softening up are wrong in the sense they cannot really get their point, right?
Yes.
Well, may I ask you something? Would you accept that Aristotle may have 2 schemes? One which is present in the politics, which is quite rude, right? And it's in this direction you have described it, in the sense that there is the opposition between body and soul, and the slave is assimilated to a sort of beast. And there is another scheme which is present in the ethical treatises, in which there seems to be some way of not treating the slaves in the same brutal way as he did it in the polis. So you have to work with 2 schemes. And at the end of your paper, you said as one of your conclusions is that nothing that Aristotle says in expounding his theory of slavery in Book 1 of the Politics militates in favor of think that by his one lights, the complete instrumentalization of natural slaves that is implied by the SoulBody model of despotic rulers is inadequate to the relationship. But it's possible that he changes a bit, and in the ethical treatise, he goes for a not too rude position, and then the model of reason and desire seems to be more suited than the other of soul and body. But I suppose you reject this possibility, right? But you do agree that there are passages in the ethical treatise that goes in are more suited to the reason desire model. So what do you do with them?
Yes, great. Thank you so much. That's a very helpful question for sort of thinking some more and also clarifying the interpretation that I want to put forward. So I guess I want to say 3 things. First, the emphasis of my paper is, of course, on Book 1 of the Politics, right? And this is the official place where Aristotle presents his theory of slavery. It's actually quite intricate, elaborate exposition of a theory it hasn't received all that much attention, certainly not in the last sort of 100 years from Aristotle scholars, because most Aristotle scholars nowadays think it's an embarrassment of a theory, and so sort of they have looked away, have looked some other way. And so as a result of this, the theory, right, in Book 1 of the Politics has really not received as much scholarly attention as many other passages from Aristotle's Politics and Ethics have received. So to some extent, I want to sort of remedy a defect of scholarship, that people have not given the kind of careful attention to the details of Aristotle's train of thought in those chapters, so from 4 to 7 of Book 1, as they have, you know, to many other passages in Aristotle's corpus. For example, if you look at how much detailed attention has been given to the discussion of akrasia in Book 7, Chapter 3, that's is a really striking contrast. And it seems to me that given the importance, and particularly the historical influence of Aristotle's theory of natural slavery, we need to really look at this carefully, and we need to sort of reconstruct the train of thought carefully and accurately. And so that's an important part, sort of what I want to do in the paper. So the sort of picture of complete instrumentalization, I think, is very clear for the politics discussion, so for those chapters. And sort of I wanted to bring this out. And in particular, it's also the case that to the extent that scholars have given careful attention to what happens in those chapters, they have, at least often, tended to sort of soften the picture in the politics in a way that I think is objectionable. So I think as a result of the sort of some interpretive moves that people have made, we have actually, to some extent, arrived at an inaccurate interpretation and reconstruction of Aristotle's theory of natural slavery in the politics. Now, Marco calls attention, right, to the text in the ethical treatises. I think it's in particular item 7 on my handout. So I don't think there's anything like this in the Eudemian ethics. In fact, my own view is that the politics often is closer to the Eudemian ethics than the Nicomachean ethics. So, you know, if one wanted to use text 7 on the handout for purposes of interpreting or reinterpreting Politics Book 1, I would object to that, right? And I've given the reasons why I would object to it in the paper. But there's another possibility, and this is, I guess, what Professor Zingano has in mind, which is that maybe we have here reason for thinking that Aristotle did have a very sort of harsh instrumentalizing view of natural slaves in the politics, maybe in the Eudemian ethics as well, but maybe at some point later on in his intellectual development, when he writes Book 8 of the Nicomachean Ethics, he has, in fact, softened his thinking about appropriate ways in which masters should interact with slaves. In fact, you know, I will talk about this some more, of course, on Friday. One thing that I will also sort of put on the table is that we have evidence that towards the very end of Aristotle's life, namely when he writes his will or testament, he actually asks for at least many of his own slaves to be released, to be given freedom. So maybe towards the end of his life, Aristotle sort of softens a bit, as people say, mellows a bit on slavery. I actually am not convinced of this either, and this is because if you look at the passage from NE 8:11, it in fact begins with exactly a recapitulation of the harsh instrumentalizing picture of the politics, right? For master and slave have nothing in common, since a slave is a tool with a soul, right? That's exactly the framework of the politics. While a slave, and then he sort of even sort of playfully adds, while a tool, for example, right, a hammer, is a slave without a soul. So there's some sort of conceptual playfulness at work on Aristotle's part here. Insofar as he's a slave, then there is no friendship with him, and so on. But then there is friendship with him insofar as he's a human being. Now, Irwin, in commenting on this, and I think this is a good possibility to bear in mind, is that in this passage there is no reference to natural slaves. And so maybe the passage is supposed to apply sort of broadly or widely to all cases where one person is in fact enslaved to another. Of course, Aristotle will think, and he recognizes this, right? This is at the beginning, or it's in chapter 6 of book 1 of the Politics, where there's a reference to conventional slavery, a slavery by law or custom, by nomos, as well as to natural slavery. And Aristotle is, of course, aware of the fact that many people are actually enslaved, legally enslaved, in his environment, who don't meet the description of a natural slave, right, as he gives it in chapter 5. So then maybe the idea here is in NE 811, right? This is a quite general claim about slavery. In many cases of actually enslaved people, the people in question may in fact have rational capacities that are more or less normal, so that they are human beings with whom there are, as he puts it there, ties of justice, because the people in question are capable of community in law and agreement. So maybe this is supposed to be sort of a more general kind of claim, that there are cases of actual enslavement where a genuine form of friendship, insofar as the two individuals are human beings and are sort of more or less ordinarily developed human beings, so that there can in fact be ties of justice based on community of law. This may well be the case in many cases of actual enslavement. But that's compatible with thinking that in cases where the enslaved person is a natural slave, as Aristotle thinks of them, and the master is a virtuous person with practical wisdom who knows what the appropriate way of dealing with a slave is, in that kind of case, Aristotle might think everything that he has said in the Politics is exactly right, and the master should completely instrumentalize. The virtuous master should completely instrumentalize the person who in fact is not just a slave by law, not just has that legal status, but also is, as Aristotle thinks of it, naturally suited to the role of being enslaved. And then this sort of description, right, that Aristotle comes up with, I insist, right, in the NE 811 passage, that the slave is a tool with a soul, and so on, that would exactly be appropriate, Aristotle himself thinks, right, to that person. So, right, there are quite a few things in place. So, of course, my resistance to thinking that Aristotle softened a bit when he writes the NE 8, my resistance to that thought is itself softer than my resistance to thinking that this passage should be used to interpret the Politics 1 theory of friendship. But even so, even though my resistance is softer, I still want to resist.
Yeah, thank you for this point. I do agree with you, and I'm quite sympathetic to your reading. But may I just push the point a bit further? I was thinking basically in book 5, which is a common book. Mm-hmm. What is quite interesting is that in book 5 on justice, he puts together children, women, and slaves, and distinguish between them, of course, right? So you have women, and then children, and then slaves. Well, children, they are just temporarily in that position. But this group is quite distinct from the group you have, the set you have so well described in the Politics, which are kitemata, beasts, slaves, and this is it, right? So it seems to be
body parts,
and body parts, right? So that seem to be two different models Aristotle is working with, and in the ethical treatise, it seems to have a not so repugnant position as he had in the Politics. So.
Well, then we should look at the passage from NE 5, which is also EE 4, right? Yes, so that's a really interesting suggestion. So there is the idea that there are requirements of justice that we have towards slaves, right? Just as there are requirements of justice towards children and towards women, and of course also towards free adult men. But then, even in the Politics discussion, of course, one of the conclusions that he means to establish is that for the relevant kind of person, that's to say for people who meet the description of natural slaves, it is just to be enslaved, right? So he wants to argue not only that it's beneficial, but also that it's just. So you might well think that in the case of a person who meets that description of a natural slave, and in the case of a person who meets the description of virtuous master, what the master owes to the slave is precisely the kind of despotic rule that he describes, right, in the politics discussion. So this will come with certain constraints, right? So one could presumably also, in some sense, treat a domestic animal in an inappropriate way. Sort of gratuitous acts of cruelty, for example, towards a domestic animal. Presumably that would also be inappropriate. But it's a far, so it's a big step to make from that kind of idea, right? To think that, in fact, there is sort of mutual or reciprocal justice between the master and the slave. So what the requirements of justice might come down to is just that there are certain kinds of guidelines or constraints to how a master should treat a person who's a natural slave.
Okay, thank you. Well, I have two other questions, but I stop here and I'd like to ask if other people have questions and points to discuss.
I have one.
Yes, please, go ahead.
There is an aspect here that I did not catch. So I'm referring to the first paragraph here.
Mm-hmm.
So the Aristotle start comparing soul and body to the way that I gather from this. So he is comparing the soul and the body to establish a relationship of dominance between one to another in different occasions, when the body is healthy and when it's not. And he does that, I believe, to argue further in the book, to understand the human being condition, right? So, but when I was reading here, in the second part of this paragraph,
Mm-hmm.
In the cases it is evident that is natural and beneficial for the body to be ruled by the soul, and for the affective part of the soul, which is one of the three, right, parts, to be ruled by reason. And then it would be harmful to all if these elements were equal. So my question is why the inequality between body and soul is not good. I was expecting not this.
Wait, but so he's saying, and it would be harmful to all if these elements were equal.
Equal. Why?
They
equal?
should. The idea is they should be unequal.
Yeah.
Right. That's what he's saying.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it would be bad, he's saying, that if the relationship were not one of inequality but one of equality.
Yeah.
But isn't that exactly what you expect?
No. I was expecting them from being like unequal. Is this what is implied here?
Yes, so his view is that they should not be equal.
Okay.
There
So
should be inequality,
Okay,
right?
my bad.
Yes. No, that's what he's saying there. And it would be even worse, right? The idea is if the hierarchical relation were overturned and reversed,
Mhm.
right? It would be even worse, he thinks, for example, if body ruled over soul,
Mhm.
or if the affective part ruled over reason. But
Okay.
he's saying it would also be bad, right, if body and soul were equal
Mhm.
partners
Okay.
in running the person's life. Or for that matter, it would be bad if reason and the affective part were equal partners.
Okay.
He insists on the importance and benefit of inequality, right?
Okay.
Where one part is in charge, is in power, and the other part is the subject.
Okay.
Other questions? Otherwise, I will make a question that I'm sure Eduardo is thinking about. But please, maybe you have it
Okay, so
better than I.
It's always a pleasure to hear you. One quick clarification, so I can understand the way you're treating Furtenbach and Smith discussion. So I had the impression, I was under the impression that what Smith was arguing against Fortenbach was not that he was wrong in trying to smooth things with the soul, reason and motion, soul emotion model, but that with that model, he could not sustain Aristotle's primary reason for supposing that there are such a thing as a natural slave. He concludes his article against Fortenbach saying that, well, that model can, this model, soul, body / beast, can actually serves as a basis for claiming that there are such a thing as a natural slave. But from the moment you step in this, the reason disappears because you actually gives the slave the possibility to engage with his master, and in doing so, by doing so, he actually benefits from his master's reasons. So the arrangement disappears. So this is how I was reading. But even Fortenbach was not actually smoothing things up for Aristotle's argument. He was just saying, I can make two claims compatible. The idea that there are natural slaves in Aristotle's system, and that they are not completely apart from the human species, even though they are instrumentalized. So this is just a quick clarification so I can understand how you think that your model, focusing on a different thing, I thought it was really interesting the way you tried to emphasize this, the idea of their bodies being the best thing that they can offer. How is this a different model from those two previous ones?
Right, great, thank you so much. That's a very helpful question. So yes, I completely agree with you about your characterization of Smith's picture. The way I see the relationship between Fortenbach, or the dynamic, right, between Fortenbach and Smith is maybe slightly different from yours, but I think mainly we might have a disagreement about what Fortenbach is trying to do.
Okay.
So I take it that Fortenbach emphasizes the idea that Aristotle has made some progress in his own theoretical development about the relationship between reason and emotion.
Okay.
That's the sort of central idea in Fortenbach, and then Fortenbach thinks that Aristotle sort of applies that kind of new insight into the relation between reason and emotion to various kinds of hierarchical structures, both the hierarchical structure between husband and wife, and also in a different way the hierarchical structure between slave and master. And then the idea would be that what Aristotle says about natural slaves when he denies them reason is actually sort of a softer claim than what might think it is. That's because Aristotle has developed this very rich and richly cognitive notion of the emotions, and so he sort of proposes to read or interpret natural slaves in terms of that rich cognitive notion of the emotions. And then that makes it at least sort of reasonable to think that Aristotle thinks of the right kind of rule between master and slave sort of somehow in light of his own conception of the rule of reason over emotion. And I think that's at least an impression that you might easily get sort of coming away from Fortenbach's picture. And so that's the sort of impression that I want to associate at least with Fortenbach. Then Smith comes along and says, I think there I'm sort of more on firmer ground, because he makes this completely explicit, sort of along the lines that you described. So the idea is that the soul-body model for thinking about the relationship between masters and natural slaves is appropriate to thinking about sort of the way in which the people Aristotle thinks of as natural slaves are when they are not yet enslaved, right? When they are sort of out there in their various sort of geographical places, in the northern barbarian places of what in fact is central or Eastern Central Europe, right? We're talking about Bulgaria, where the Thracians are from, and so on. That's the sort of geography that Aristotle associates with slaves, probably. In any case, that's where most of the actual enslaved people in classical antiquity came from. So this is Smith's picture, and I think we're completely in agreement about this. The soul-body sort of model works well for natural slaves who are not yet enslaved. Once such a person comes into the household of a virtuous master, Smith thinks, right, then all kinds of things can happen to the enslaved person. In all kinds of ways they can be sort of cultivated, educated, develop the limited rational capacities that they have. But now, and this is the bit that I object to, right? So Smith then thinks, in that kind of case, the soul-body model for thinking about their hierarchical power relation is no longer adequate, right? Because now, in fact, I think he then sort of picks this up from Fortenbaugh. Now another kind of model would be more appropriate. Not the soul-body model, but the reason-emotion model, right? Because the idea is that in the context of a virtuous household, an enslaved person can actually sort of develop their cognitive capacity, which, as Fortenbaugh shows, is part of the Aristotelian conception of the emotions, so that now a different kind of model, which is no longer a complete instrumentalization model, becomes appropriate. So then in Smith we get this idea that Aristotle's theory is inconsistent, right? Because the idea is he has a sort of workable sort of picture that, as you say, justifies the existence of natural slaves, but doesn't apply well to the sort of way in which a natural slave should be treated by a virtuous master in the context of a well-run household. So it's really this, right, that I'm opposing, because I'm thinking that Aristotle's theory is completely consistent in holding that the relationship between soul and body and the complete instrumentalization that goes with this is also appropriate for the interaction and the sort of structuring of power relations in the household between virtuous masters and enslaved people, no matter for how many years they have been in the household, and no matter how they have sort of developed. Now the idea is, right, they have acquired these sort of versions of the virtues of courage and temperance under the guidance of the virtuous master. But then, right, for the reasons I've explained in the paper, I take these virtues not to be human virtues, but to be just sort of instrumental virtues that relate to the performance or accomplishment of their work, which is the use of their body, right? And in doing this, you know, I think I haven't sort of done anything other than just give proper prominence to Aristotle's own sort of central examples and Aristotle's own official model, right, of how despotic rule should work, which he himself introduces very clearly. I don't think, you know, I've done any sort of twisting to the text. He interprets this very clearly and explicitly in terms of sort of the example of the way in which the soul rules the body. So it's, in fact, really somewhat surprising to me that one can actually be incredibly at odds with so much, one can be in such strong disagreement with so much of the recent secondary literature on this very text by simply making prominent the passages that Aristotle himself gives us, sort of for thinking about natural slavery. I've been working on Aristotle, as you know, for a long time. I often disagree quite strongly with sort of other commentators, but usually that's because sort of I look to passages that sort of are a little bit at the periphery of the discussion. Maybe I interpret them a little bit differently from the way other people interpret them. Here I'm looking at a passage which is not peripheral but central, and I make that sort of passage central to my own interpretation, and I think I'm not interpreting the passage in sort of a eccentric or surprising way. And sort of then by building an interpretation around that passage understood in, I think, a very straightforward way, I find myself in strong disagreement with the sort of recent secondary literature on the text. So it's a sort of surprising position to be in.
It's not Aristotle in his best days.
Please, go ahead.
Good evening, Professor Hendrik and Marco. I'd like to make a very beginner's question because I'm really a newcomer in this Aristotle thing. If I understood right, the proof that this class, this group of people are destined to be slaves or to be treated as slaves is solely got by observation, by empirical observation. So Aristotle is affirming that any person who, with capacity of reason, who would observe these people would conclude that they should be slaves. Then, okay.
Yes, I mean, so with some, basically I think this is correct, but sort of with some qualifications. So, right, the idea is that these are, and to some extent I will enter into some of these qualifications on Friday when I have much more to say about the actual people, the actual places they come from, their actual physiologies and so on, that Aristotle thinks, in fact, are like this. So we'll talk more about this. But I think one important qualification that should already be entered, and that will also become more explicit on Friday, is that Aristotle may well think it's a rather difficult task to figure out, even sort of for experienced, intelligent, practically wise person. It might be a difficult task to confidently and reliably settle the question whether this or that individual actually is someone who meets the description of a natural slave, right, that he comes up with. So it's the claim that they don't have rational capacity other than whatever rational capacity is involved in understanding an order and responding to criticism. I take it that's the sort of level of rational capacity that he wants to ascribe to these people, to the people he describes as natural slaves. And in addition to that, there has to be a certain kind of emotional disposition, which is that this is someone who doesn't mind being bossed around, who doesn't object, doesn't have a sort of sense of pride that would be hurt by just complying with orders.
Those would be stable and previous qualities in these people.
Those would be stable qualities, right? That's sorry?
Imprevious to the act of enslaving.
Yes, exactly, right? So then his idea is, we'll see more about this on Friday, that there are in fact communities, human communities that live in various places, at the Greek periphery outside of Athens definitely, where people can be found who have that kind of psychological profile and who have that cognitive profile. So then I think his idea is that sort of experts, if everything were to be done exactly sort of as justice requires, experts would go out into those geographies, would go to those places, and would try to sort of observe these communities to see whether in their interactions with one another, they show that the individuals in those communities have that kind of psychological and cognitive profile.
Ancient day social anthropology.
Yes. But of course, also with a strong connection, as often in anthropology, in the history of anthropology, with a strong connection with exploitation and oppression, right? So because the idea, of course, would be we don't do this sort of for purely theoretical or scientific purposes. This is done for practical purposes in order to find suitable places and suitable populations, right?
Sure.
For extracting slaves. But yes, I think that's the sort of short version of an answer to your question.
Very interesting, thank you.
Well, I think our time is up, and so you have already made the ad for Friday.
Yes.
So I hope you'll be back here and you'll be discussing again. Thank you again for this very clear presentation of Aristotle in his bad days, right? Thank you, Hendrik.